Diesel engines rattled her awake before the alarm could even think about sounding. It was a heavy, low-frequency thrum that vibrated through the single-pane windows of the farmhouse, shaking months of dust off the sill. Brushing off the heavy quilt, Bridget hit the freezing linoleum with bare feet and marched to the kitchen window. Outside, the sky hung like a bruised knee, that dull, winter upstate purple. Below her, a rusted tri-axle dump truck was backing up to the wire fence. The diesel engine woke her before the alarm had a chance to. It was a heavy, low-frequency rattle that vibrated through the single-pane windows of Bridget's farmhouse, shaking the dust off the sill. She threw off the heavy quilt, her bare feet hitting the freezing linoleum, and walked to the kitchen window. The sky was the color of a bruised knee, that dull, winter upstate purple. Through the frost on the glass, she saw it. A rusted tri-axle dump truck, backing up to the wire fence that separated her 3 acres of mostly mud and thistles from the county road. Bridget grabbed her coat. She didn't bother with boots, just shoved her feet into an old pair of sneakers by the door. By the time she made it off the porch, the truck bed was already angled at 45 degrees. "Hey!" she yelled, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "Hey, shut it down!" The driver couldn't hear her, or chose not to. The tailgate unlatched with a metallic screech that echoed across the empty fields. Then came the thunder. Massive, misshapen logs, some still wrapped in shaggy bark, others split and splintered, slid from the steel bed and crashed onto her property. The ground actually shuddered. It sounded like a train derailment. 10 tons of raw, twisted white oak, piled high and ugly right on top of her crushed blackberry bushes. The truck bed slammed back down. The driver, a kid barely out of his teens wearing a high-vis beanie, finally looked out his window. He gave her a blank, unbothered stare, put the rig in drive, and rolled away, kicking up gravel and leaving a thick cloud of exhaust in his wake. Bridget stood there in the cold, staring at the pile. It was massive. It smelled like wet dirt, rot and raw tannins. She marched back inside, her fingers numb, and dug the local directory out of a kitchen drawer. There was only one outfit in town running trucks that size: Miller and Sons Timber. She dialed the number. A man picked up after 7 rings. He sounded like he was chewing on a cigar, though she knew he probably just had that permanent, gravelly tone, born from cheap coffee and yelling over heavy machinery. "Miller's. One of your drivers just dumped a load of logs on my property," Bridget said. Her voice was shaking, but not from the cold. "Off County Route 9, the old blue farmhouse." A pause, the sound of a page turning. "Yeah, Route 9. That's a county easement." "It's my land," Bridget snapped. "Inside my fence line. You crushed my fence." "Listen, lady," the voice drawled, devoid of any real sympathy. "Driver said he had a blowout. Had to dump the load to save the axle. We'll get a crew out there to clean it up when the ground thaws. Right now, it's mud season. I can't put a loader in that ditch without burying it." "When the ground thaws?" Bridget repeated, incredulous. It was late November. "That's 4 months from now." "Tell you what, if it's bothering you, put up a free firewood sign. Folks love free wood." The line went dead. Bridget slowly lowered the phone. She walked back to the window. The pile of wood sat there, a massive, jagged middle finger on her property line. She didn't have the money for a lawyer. She barely had the money to keep the propane tank filled. She was 32, 3 years out of a brutal divorce that had drained her savings, and working a remote data entry job that paid just enough to keep her slowly drowning. She had bought this cheap, run-down farmhouse because it was all she could afford, hoping for quiet. Instead, she got this. For the first 3 weeks, the pile was just a monument to her own powerlessness. Every time she pulled out of her driveway, she had to look at it. It was cull wood, the stuff the lumber yard rejected. Trees that grew twisted, trunks full of knots, burls and rot. Too ugly for clean dimensional lumber, too big and awkwardly shaped for the chipper. It was trash. And because she was a woman living alone with no money and no local clout, they had decided her front yard was a perfectly acceptable landfill. She did what Miller suggested. She put up a cardboard sign by the road. Free firewood. A few guys in pickup trucks stopped over the weekend. They got out, kicked the logs, and shook their heads. Too green, one old-timer told her, spitting tobacco juice into the frost. White oak, hard as iron. You try splitting this with an axe, it'll bounce right back and take your teeth out. Got to sit for 2 years before it'll burn right. Nobody's going to haul this away for free, sweetheart. They all drove off. Bridget was left alone with the wood. By December, the snow came, covering the jagged logs in a soft white blanket, but she still knew they were there. They felt like a physical weight on her chest, a reminder that in this world, if you didn't have leverage, people would just dump their problems on you and drive away. One night, sitting in her freezing kitchen with a mug of cheap tea, Bridget opened her laptop. She searched for how to get rid of giant oak logs. The results were mostly forums of arborists complaining. But then she clicked on a video. It was a guy in a plaid shirt, running a chainsaw horizontally down a massive, ugly log. He had a metal frame attached to the saw, an Alaskan mill. He peeled the top half of the log away, and Bridget stopped breathing. The outside of the log was grey, cracked and ugly. But the inside was a swirling, golden map of ribbons and waves. The knots that made the wood useless to the commercial lumber yard created chaotic, beautiful ripples in the grain. It was stunning. She looked out her dark window toward the front yard. Miller had said it was trash. The old man said it was too hard to split. But what if it isn't firewood, she thought. Bridget opened a new tab. She checked her bank account. She had $600 to her name until the end of the month. She went to Craigslist. She searched. Chainsaw. The saw cost her $400. It was a used Husqvarna, heavy, stained with bar oil, and intimidating. The man who sold it to her, a retired landscaper named Dale, looked at her thin arms and raised an eyebrow. "You ever run one of these?" Dale asked, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "No," Bridget lied. She had used a tiny electric one once, years ago. "Keep your left arm locked," he grunted, taking her cash. "If it kicks back and your elbow is bent, it'll put the chain right through your collarbone." Bridget swallowed hard. Got it. She ordered the Alaskan mill attachment and a ripping chain online. That took the rest of her money. For the next 10 days, she ate rice, beans, and whatever canned soup was left in the pantry. She spent her evenings obsessively watching videos on milling, learning about wood movement, moisture content, and safety. When the metal frame arrived, she dragged the heavy saw out to the frost-covered pile. The air was bitter cold. Her breath hung in the air. She spent an hour wrestling one of the smaller logs, still a good 500 pounds, out of the pile and onto 2 smaller spacer logs to keep the saw out of the dirt. She bolted the mill to the chainsaw bar. She poured in the mixed gas. She pulled the starter cord. Nothing. She pulled it again. Her shoulder twinged. She pulled it 5 more times, swearing loudly into the empty rural landscape. On the 8th pull, the engine roared to life. The smell of 2-cycle exhaust filled the crisp air. It was loud, deafeningly loud. Bridget engaged the throttle. The chain spun into a blur. She approached the end of the log, lined up the rails of the mill, and pushed the spinning blade into the end grain of the white oak. The saw screamed. Sawdust, wet, heavy, and smelling strongly of vanilla and bourbon, blasted out of the chute, covering her boots. It was agonizing work. The oak was incredibly dense. Every inch was a physical battle. The vibration traveled up her arms, rattling her teeth. Her back screamed in protest as she bent over the rig, slowly inching the saw forward. 10 minutes passed. 20. She was sweating through her heavy coat, despite the freezing temperature. The smoke from the exhaust stung her eyes. When the saw finally broke through the other end of the 8-foot log, the engine revved high and free. Bridget killed the power. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in her ears. She walked around to the side of the log. She wedged a crowbar into the cut and leaned her entire body weight onto it. With a wet suction sound, the heavy top slab popped off and fell into the snow. Bridget stared. The freshly cut surface was wet and raw. The grain was a wild, sweeping storm of amber and pale yellow. Where a branch had grown and died, leaving a massive, dense knot, the wood fibers curled around it like water flowing past a stone in a river. It was chaotic. It was flawed. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She dragged her gloved hand across the rough, wet surface. She felt a sudden, hot sting behind her eyes. For 3 years, she had felt like garbage, discarded, tossed aside because she didn't fit into the neat, easy parameters of her old life. This wood was discarded for the same reason. It was too difficult, too stubborn. Over the next 2 months, Bridget didn't sleep much. She milled on the weekends and early mornings before she logged into her miserable data entry job. Her hands developed thick, yellow calluses. Her fingernails were permanently stained black from the tannins in the oak, reacting to the metal of her tools. Her back ached constantly. She smelled perpetually of gas and wet wood. But she didn't care. The pile in her front yard was shrinking, transformed into neat stacks of heavy slabs, stickered and stacked in her drafty barn to dry. She knew they needed years to air dry properly, but she couldn't wait. She built a crude kiln in the corner of the barn using foam insulation board, a cheap dehumidifier, and a space heater. It was a massive fire hazard, and it spiked her electric bill, but it brought the moisture content of 3 slabs down to a workable level in a matter of weeks. She dragged the best slab into her living room. She couldn't afford a proper workbench, so she laid it across 2 plastic sawhorses. She bought a cheap, used belt sander. The dust was horrendous. It coated the walls, the television, the kitchen counters. She wore a heavy respirator and ear protection, spending hours grinding away the chainsaw marks. She moved from 60 grit paper to 80 to 120. With every pass of the sander, the colors deepened. The hidden life of the tree came to the surface. She filled the deep cracks and voids with black epoxy, binding the broken pieces of the wood together rather than trying to hide them. She bought heavy, matte black steel legs online and bolted them to the bottom. Finally, she poured a clear oil finish over the top and rubbed it into the grain with a cotton rag. The wood drank the oil, instantly popping with an almost 3-dimensional depth. The golden hues caught the dim light of her living room. It was a dining table. It was massive, heavy enough to survive a bomb blast, and undeniably stunning. She sat back on her heels, taking off her respirator. She looked at the table. Then she looked out the window at the snow-covered pile still waiting in the yard. Miller threw this away, she thought. Bridget took some photos of the table with her phone. The lighting was bad, the background was just her messy living room, but the table commanded attention. She posted it on a local community page and Facebook marketplace. She didn't know what to ask for it. She calculated the cost of the steel legs, the sandpaper, the oil, and the gas. Maybe $300? She typed, "Custom white oak dining table." $800. She clicked post, feeling slightly ridiculous. No one was going to pay $800 for a table built by a depressed data clerk in a dusty living room. Her phone buzzed 3 hours later. It was a message from a woman named Helen, a realtor who lived in a wealthy suburb 2 hours south. "Is this still available? I've been looking for something exactly like this for a client's modern farmhouse staging. It has so much character." Bridget stared at the screen. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. "Yes," Bridget typed back. "It is." The woman arrived the next day in a spotless SUV. She wore expensive boots that she hesitated to get dirty in Bridget's muddy driveway. When she walked into the house and saw the table in person, she audibly gasped. "The pictures did not do this justice," Helen said, running her manicured hand over the glassy, smooth surface of the black epoxy filling a knot. "It's so visceral. Where did you get the wood?" Bridget looked out the window. "A local supplier." Helen paid her $800 in crisp $100 bills. She brought a guy with a van to help load it. When the van pulled away, Bridget stood on her porch, holding the cash. It was more money than she made in a week at her day job. She looked at the money, and then she walked out to the pile of logs. There were at least 30 logs left. Some were twice the size of the one she had just milled. A slow, sharp smile spread across Bridget's face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had just found the loaded gun the enemy had carelessly left behind. They hadn't dumped trash on her property. They had dumped inventory, and she was going to sell every single piece of it right back to the world. Bridget didn't quit her data entry job immediately. She just stopped caring about it. She let the emails pile up in her inbox while she wrestled with the chainsaw in the snow. When her manager finally called to fire her 4 weeks later, citing a severe decline in productivity, Bridget simply hung up the phone, put her ear protection back on, and went back to the barn. She was terrified, yes. Her stomach was a tight, cold knot of anxiety, but the fear of starving was abruptly eclipsed by the visceral, intoxicating high of cash in hand. Helen, the realtor, had posted photos of that first table in a staged dining room. Within 48 hours, Bridget's inbox wasn't filled with corporate spreadsheets. It was flooded with inquiries from interior designers, boutique hotel managers, and wealthy homeowners. They didn't just want a table. They wanted the story. Bridget realized very quickly that she wasn't just selling wood. She was selling a rustic, gritty fantasy to people who lived in sterile, temperature-controlled glass boxes. They wanted the knots. They wanted the wild grain. They wanted the deep, black epoxy rivers that filled the cracks because it made the furniture look like it had survived something terrible. It was an aesthetic of trauma and endurance, polished to a high sheen and sold for a premium. She priced her second table at $2,000. A tech executive named Harrison bought it without blinking. She priced the third at $3,500. A restaurant owner in the city drove a U-Haul up to her muddy farmhouse to get it. By March, the snow began to melt, turning her property into a treacherous swamp of mud and sawdust. The original pile of dumped logs was down to a dozen massive, intimidating trunks. Bridget was physically exhausted. Her shoulders were perpetually knotted, her knuckles swollen. She had lost 10 pounds of soft weight and replaced it with dense, aching muscle. She looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror one morning and barely recognized the hard-eyed, stained woman staring back. She needed to scale. The chainsaw mill was too slow, and it was destroying her back. She took the $7,000 sitting in her checking account and bought a used gas-powered band sawmill. It arrived on a flatbed trailer, a long steel track with a heavy cutting head that rolled smoothly along the rails. She also bought an old, rusted yellow tractor with a front-end loader to move the logs. It smelled like stale beer and leaked hydraulic fluid, but it lifted 1,000 pounds of white oak without groaning. The first time she rolled a heavy log onto the steel bed of the sawmill and pushed the blade through, she almost laughed out loud. What took her an hour of back-breaking labor with the chainsaw now took 60 seconds. The blade hissed through the oak, slicing perfect uniform slabs. She hired a local guy named Wyatt to help her sand and finish. Wyatt was a quiet, brooding 20-something who had dropped out of community college and spent his days fixing old motorcycles. He didn't ask questions. He put on his respirator, turned up his heavy metal music, and sanded the wood until his hands went numb. They transformed the drafty barn into a proper production floor. Bridget built 3 large kilns, properly wired this time, to dry the slabs in a fraction of the time. The house permanently smelled of curing epoxy, mineral spirits, and charred wood. The orders kept coming. Her prices climbed to $5,000 a table, then $7,000. People paid it. They liked the exclusivity. They liked telling their dinner guests that the table was built by a woman in a remote upstate farmhouse, using discarded, reclaimed timber. By August, the mud had dried to hard, cracked earth. Bridget and Wyatt had milled, dried, sanded, and shipped out 42 tables. Then she hit a wall. She walked out to the yard on a humid Tuesday morning with her coffee. The front field was empty. The crushed blackberry bushes were trying to grow back through a thick layer of decomposing bark and sawdust. The monumental pile of trash that Miller and Sons had dumped on her land was completely gone. Bridget went back inside, opened her laptop, and logged into her business bank account. She stared at the screen. $112,460. She had done it. She had turned an act of profound disrespect into a 6-figure bankroll in less than a year. The quiet victory settled deep in her chest, warm and solid. But the factory she had built in her barn was hungry. Wyatt needed hours. The kilns were empty. She needed more wood. She needed the ugly, rejected, knotted garbage that the commercial mills threw away. Bridget grabbed her keys. Miller and Sons Timber occupied a massive industrial lot on the north end of the county. The air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust, pine sap, and burning slash. Giant yellow loaders scurried across the dirt like angry beetles, carrying stacks of perfect, straight-edged lumber. Bridget parked her dirty, sensible sedan between 2 lifted pickup trucks. She walked into the main office. It was a wood-paneled room that smelled like old coffee and cigarette smoke. A man sat behind a scarred desk, yelling into a phone clamped between his ear and shoulder. He had a graying beard, a hard gut, and grease under his fingernails. He slammed the phone down. He looked up at Bridget, his expression impatient. "Help you?" he barked. "I'm looking for Miller," Bridget said. "You found him. Make it quick. I'm down 2 drivers today." Bridget stepped up to the desk. She didn't smile. She didn't try to look friendly or accommodating. 9 months ago, one of your drivers had a blowout on County Route 9. He dumped 10 tons of cull white oak inside my fence line to save his axle. Miller narrowed his eyes, searching his memory. He leaned back in his chair, the leather squeaking. "Right. The farmhouse. Look, lady, I told you back then we'd get around to cleaning it up. We've been slammed. If you're here to threaten a lawsuit, save your breath. The county easement gives us leeway on emergency dumps." "I don't want to sue you," Bridget said. Her voice was calm, steady, and devoid of any emotion. "I want to buy more of it." Miller stopped. He stared at her, blinking. "More of what?" "Your cull wood," Bridget said. "The twisted stuff, the crotch pieces, the logs full of burls and rot that you can't run through your commercial blades. You usually chip it or burn it, right?" "We leave it in the slash piles to rot," Miller corrected. still looking at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "It's garbage. It ruins the blades on our big saws. Nobody wants it." "I want it," Bridget said. She pulled a folder from her bag and laid it on his desk. She opened it. Inside were high-resolution, glossy photos of her finished tables. The deep, rich golden grain, the black epoxy rivers, the heavy steel legs. They looked like pieces of art sitting in million-dollar dining rooms. Miller leaned forward. He picked up one of the photos. His thick, calloused thumb traced the image of a massive knot that he would have thrown in a fire pit. "You built this?" he asked, his voice dropping its defensive edge. "I did," Bridget said, "from the pile your driver left in my yard." Miller stared at the photo for a long time. The silence in the office was heavy, broken only by the rumble of the loaders outside. He was doing the math in his head. He knew wood. He knew what a piece of custom furniture like that commanded in the city. He looked up at her, a new grudging respect in his eyes. It was the look of one predator acknowledging another. "You turned my trash into a gold mine," he muttered. "I turned your disrespect into a business," Bridget corrected him softly. "Now, I need inventory. I need a steady supply of your ugliest, most unworkable oak and walnut. And because it's a byproduct that costs you money to haul away, I expect a very favorable price." Miller barked a sudden rough laugh. He tossed the photo back onto the desk. "You've got nerve, lady. I'll give you that. What are you paying?" 50 cents a board foot," Bridget said. Miller scoffed. $1. 60 cents. And you deliver it to my yard, properly, without crushing my fence." Miller looked at her. He saw the calluses on her hands, the permanent black stains around her cuticles, the unyielding set of her jaw. He realized she wasn't some bored housewife looking for a hobby. She was a manufacturer. 75 cents delivered, he grunted. "And you take whatever cull we pull, sight unseen." "Deal," Bridget said. She reached out her hand. Miller shook it. His grip was bone-crushing, but Bridget didn't flinch. When she walked out of the office and back into the bright, dusty sunlight of the lumber yard, her legs felt a little weak. The adrenaline was finally wearing off. She got into her car, shut the door, and let out a long, shuddering breath. She gripped the steering wheel. Her hands were rough, scarred, and strong. They had tried to bury her. They had tried to make their problem her burden. But she had taken their heavy, ugly weight and carved something beautiful out of it. She started the engine, the low hum vibrating through the floorboards. Bridget put the car in drive and pulled out of the lot, leaving the dust behind her. She had to get home. Wyatt was waiting, and there was work to do. If Bridget's journey from a discarded backyard dump to a six-figure empire struck a chord with you, don't let her story end here. We bring you raw, unfiltered tales of resilience, grit, and quiet defiance every single week. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like to support the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that their lowest moment might just be their greatest opportunity. Turn your own heavy burdens into undeniable, lasting strength today.